we're going to be listening to MovieBob, which, as the name implies, he mostly does movies. He doesn't do television. It's going to be a very short take on Season 8, but even as short as it is, it's packing a lot of stuff. And let me just thank Lord Dunn for calling this to my attention. I would have gotten to this anyway, but subscribe to him. He's a good guy, even though we've gotten into a little bit of dispute on an unrelated topic, but we'll get through it. But anyway, so MovieBob is going to do his little breakdown of Season 8, and boy, he's going to make a couple of big leaps, and we're going to see if he can really justify his steps, which I think no, but we'll see.
Before this because I didn't really feel like, and also because it's kind of hard to cover a show that seemed like it was mainly novel for being a mainstream audience's first exposure to the concept of mixing hard R, sex violence, and what passes for political complexity in American TV into an otherwise traditional medieval fantasy setting on a show like this that presumes a certain level of more than mainstream familiarity with genre stuff like this, i.e. an audience who, when I point out that the popular joke about Game of Thrones just being Lord of the Rings plus sex is cute, but it'd be more accurate to say that Tolkien was basically doing Marie-Catherine Le Jumelle de Barneville, Baroness d'Aulnay, without the sex, while Game of Thrones is really closer to an edgy version of Shrek, will laugh at that, or at least know why they're supposed to laugh at that if my delivery didn't suck. But did I like it? It was fine, yeah. No ending was going to uplift and satisfy everyone because it's not what dark fantasy serialized drama does, but it mostly got the job done-ish, and I didn't feel it was a complete whiff of a thing. Nothing really came out of left field that didn't ultimately make sense. My personal favorite character stayed pretty consistent in an interesting way. It's interesting to find out that I guess the dragons could either grasp what humans were saying this whole time,
All right, I think the most vulnerable spot, of course, would be ultimately it makes sense. Now, that's very critical. He uses that phrase, ultimately it makes sense. I would agree, but we have to make a critical step, which he never really lays out, which is like, well, after season 4, things get so crazy. This isn't much more crazy than post season 4. I'd agree. Yes, there was a lot of severe retconning that occurred after season 4. And once we see this new universe of Game of Thrones, then yeah, the things that happened in season 8 weren't that much more crazy post season 4. But now we have the problem, well, what about seasons 1, 2, 3, and 4? Like, why should we give up the grounded reality of those earlier seasons? He doesn't spell it out. He just lumps all the seasons together as if, well, it's all medieval fantasy. Well, first, I challenge him that Game of Thrones ever was really medieval, but we'll save that video essay for another time. But his most impressive evidence is, well, this strikes me as like Shrek. Like, I'm one of the few people that has not actually watched a lot of Shrek. But I know what Shrek is. I know the basic outline. But I'm like, what? Because they got a troll, and they got castles, and they got princes and princesses. The connective tissue isn't holding up. You got to give us more than just, well, it's kind of like Shrek, and that answers the question. It really doesn't. But I think the big one, though, is like, well, no ending would satisfy everyone. Now, if we keep to the medieval fantasy stuff, then maybe not. But then later, he redefines it as dark fantasy. And that one is like, whoa, that is just not true. And we can give 2 immediate examples, but I'll give a third, which is Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel. Now, Buffy I would regard as more light fantasy, not dark fantasy, although it began as basically a horror series. But if you go to the 7th and final season, it is fairly dark. It was really, really dark. I mean, they ended in a very dark place. It still had a kind of fairy tale ending, which was not satisfying to me, but that season is really dark. I mean, the body count is enormous in season 7, so I think you could qualify Buffy at the end as dark fantasy. But let's turn to a solid example like Angel. Angel throughout its entire course was always dark fantasy, and it also had a very divisive ending. Though I think on par now, most fans like it and at least respect what they tried to do with it. As satisfying conclusions go, the Angel one was pretty strong because they had to improvise it. They didn't know they were ending. They were just canceled or abruptly, and Joss Whedon did, I think, a fairly good job of improvising the ending, and he stands by it. And after all these years, nobody's writing articles that this is one of the worst endings of all time. Again, even people who are passive fans or not fans of Angel at all, don't regard it as one of the worst endings of television. At least for most people, it is considered a fairly solid ending. And then we have Sons of Anarchy, which is also can be something considered dark fantasy. And again, the ending I think was disappointing to many people, but it was not considered this abysmally stupid conclusion to the series. So it's just not true. We just have good empirical examples that no, you can end dark fantasy if you're careful enough, or even when you have to improvise it. So either this is telling us 2 things. Either Joss Whedon is 1,000 times better as a writer than D&D, or they're incredibly mediocre. That's not to say that D&D have no talents whatsoever. I think that's incorrect. I do think we have to be careful here. They clearly did some great things, like the casting alone. Getting Natalie Dormer, Jackie, Sean, Mark, Emilia, and people like that. That's them. They did an incredible job with the casting, both the early casting and some of the later casting. We can argue the later casting did fall off a little bit, but nevertheless, the batting average is really amazing. I'd have to say at least, 75 to 80% of the casting was almost incredibly precise and picture perfect. It really did an amazing job of capturing who's probably the best person for that role, even their role, not necessarily George's character, right? Because they changed the characters a lot. So they do have some talents and they do have some gifts as producers and writers. I think the question is here, when it had to come down to ending the story, this really called for extraordinarily great writing. And that's something that they're not capable of. They may be okay writers, we can even consider them good writers, but they're not great writers, they're not extraordinary writers. And that's kind of what we needed at the end. So some fun with MovieBob. I'm sure he's not as stupid as he sounds here. And yeah, I can understand where he's framing it to try to sound reasonable, but that's making a lot of unjustified steps in my opinion. Alright, this has been GRRM Thrones Analyzed on the beginning assessment of MovieBob's concluding thoughts on Game of Thrones. Thanks for listening.